The lantern's faint flicker shakes in my hand. As I read the message my own son tried to hide from me. Still, I steady the flame, watching its jitter calm while my heartbeat refuses to follow. As that thin glow trembles across the wall, it reveals every lie I tried to excuse. While the light sways, I finally see the shape of the betrayal forming behind it. The same unbroken flicker shows me the face I should have questioned from the start. That's when I decide, if truth must burn its way out, I'll be the one holding the fire. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day is gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The rain came down in thin, icy needles, the kind that slipped beneath collars and soaked straight into bone. Henry Lawson barely felt it. He stood rooted beside the polished mahogany casket, his gaze fixed on the carved edges he had traced only an hour earlier inside the funeral home. Grace's name, her birth year, the small engraved flower she always loved, all of it blurred now through a haze of grief. The crowd had already thinned, umbrellas drifting toward waiting cars. Only he remained close, refusing to step away, refusing to accept that the woman he had shared 4 decades with was lying inside a box lowered into wet earth. The priest closed his book and murmured something Henry didn't catch. None of it mattered. None of this felt real. The police report had come so quickly, so sharply. Single vehicle collision, loss of control, fatal impact. Words delivered with practiced calm that felt like a hammer against his chest. Grace was a careful driver. Grace didn't lose control of anything. The suddenness of it left a bruise deeper than any he'd known, a strange, gnawing disbelief that refused to settle into acceptance. She had kissed him goodbye that morning. She had told him she'd be home early. How did life collapse in the span of an afternoon? A hand touched his shoulder, light, barely present. Daniel. His son's face looked tight and pale, though the emotion behind it was hard to read. "Dad," Daniel whispered, voice thin from the cold, or maybe from something else. "We should go. They're waiting to lower the casket." Henry gave the smallest nod, though his feet didn't move. Daniel lingered a moment, then squeezed his shoulder with a half-hearted firmness before stepping back. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it felt strangely hollow, as if Daniel didn't know where to place his own grief. Across from them, Megan stood under a black umbrella, her expression rigid. She watched Henry with a tension that seemed to rise and fall with each breath, as though worried he might break apart in front of everyone. Megan had always been more intuitive than her brother, more connected to her mother. Her eyes were red, but she held herself with controlled stillness, a quiet anchor in the storm. When the workers began to ready the lowering straps, Henry exhaled a breath that trembled. Something inside him resisted, almost violently, but he forced himself to step back beside his children. The rain thickened, striking the canopy above the casket with a steady patter. He felt Megan slip her arm through his. He didn't look at her, but he leaned, just barely, against her support. After the final words were spoken and the distant hum of condolences started to fade, Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He hadn't turned it on since the night everything shattered. He'd silenced the world so he could make it through this one day without more information tearing him down. The screen flickered to life. Notifications stacked one over another. Missed calls, emails, calendar reminders. None of it mattered. He was about to slide the phone back into his pocket when a single alert popped up on the top of the screen. A new text message. From Grace. His breath caught. The name alone was enough to make his chest constrict. Some automated system? A delayed message she had scheduled? Something the carrier accidentally pushed through? Hands shaking, he opened it. "I'm still alive." For a moment, Henry couldn't breathe. The cemetery sounds faded. Rain, murmurs, footsteps. Everything blurred into a distant hum. The letters on the screen didn't move, didn't distort. They remained clear, sharp, unmistakable. Another line appeared. "Trust no one, not even the kids." A pulse of white noise filled his head. His knees nearly buckled, and he grabbed the side of the bench beside him to steady himself. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, as if the world had shifted its axis without warning. Alive? Trust no one? Not even his own children? His eyes flicked instinctively toward Daniel and Megan, standing a few feet away. They were speaking quietly, unaware of the storm exploding inside him. A voice, someone from the funeral staff, asked gently if he needed a moment. Henry didn't answer. He stared at the phone, the rain streaking down the cracked screen, and felt the first threads of reality unravel. Every assumption he had carried into this day was suddenly suspect. Every detail of Grace's accident, every odd moment from the past week. They all rose in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle he had never known he was supposed to solve. He closed his fist around the phone, shielding it from sight. The world around him kept moving, unaware that everything inside him had just shifted, violently and irrevocably. Grace was alive, and she was warning him. Henry drew a slow, shaky breath, one that tasted like fear, and something sharper underneath. Determination. But before he could make sense of what to do next, one cold thought cut through the storm. If the message was real, then the danger wasn't past. It had only just begun. Henry sat in the back seat of Megan's car as she pulled away from the cemetery, but his mind was still standing in the rain, staring at the glowing screen that had detonated the life he thought he was living. The message from Grace, "I'm still alive. Trust no one, not even the kids," looped through him like a fever. His fingers tightened around the phone now resting in his coat pocket, as if afraid the text might vanish if he let go. He read it again and again. Every time the same punch landed square in his chest. There was no mistake in the number. It wasn't a spoofed contact or a glitch. He tapped the top of the screen and checked the details with the precision of a man trying to prove his own sanity. The number was identical down to the last digit. Grace's phone, the device she carried everywhere. The one she had used to call him the morning before her supposed accident. Seeing her name paired with that message felt both impossible and painfully intimate, like her voice whispering into his ear from somewhere just out of reach. His breath shortened. Sweat collected in his palms despite the cold. "Dad?" Megan's voice cut through the haze. "Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale." He forced a swallow, lifting his head enough to meet her eyes in the rearview mirror. She looked genuinely concerned, expression softening in a way that reminded him of the daughter who used to cling to Grace's hand in crowded places. "I'm fine," he lied. His voice came out thin but controlled. "Just tired. It's been a lot." Megan nodded slowly, though she didn't seem convinced. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she returned her attention to the road. Beside her in the passenger seat, Daniel was already loosening his tie, exhaling with a relief that felt out of place. He muttered something about being glad the service was over and how funerals always felt draining. His tone lacked the heaviness Henry expected. Instead, he sounded almost unburdened. Henry watched his son closely, the text replaying in his mind with brutal clarity. Not even the kids. The idea twisted sharply beneath his ribs. Daniel had been distant lately, edgy, preoccupied with problems he wouldn't talk about. Debt, Megan had said. Bad decisions he refused to explain. But betrayal? To Grace? It seemed unthinkable, yet the message insisted he consider it. When they finally reached his house, Henry stepped out before either child could offer help. He needed space, air that didn't feel crowded by secrets and eyes watching him. Megan followed him to the door, hesitating. "Call me if you need anything tonight," she said gently, "even if it's just company." He forced a nod. "I will." Daniel gave a half-hearted wave from the car before Megan drove him home. Henry waited until their taillights vanished before he entered the house. The silence hit him immediately. Too empty, too still, the kind of silence that pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. He walked through the hallway, past framed photos of a life that felt suddenly fragile. He stopped in the bedroom doorway and scanned the dresser where Grace kept her essentials: glasses, watch, old notebooks, and phones. One was missing. Grace's backup phone, a small, older model she kept stored just in case, wasn't in its usual drawer. Henry felt his pulse tick upward. She rarely touched that phone. Hardly anyone even knew it existed. He checked the drawer twice, then again, his movements sharper each time. Gone. He opened her laptop next. It powered on, but the login screen looked off. Her password hint updated, the last access time from only 2 days earlier, after the accident, after her supposed death. Someone had been in her accounts, someone who shouldn't have been. His hands hovered over the keyboard, mind racing. Had Grace accessed it herself? Had someone else? Was this connected to the message? If she was alive, where was she hiding? And why warn him about the kids? The house felt suddenly hostile, as though every shadow and quiet corner held a clue he hadn't noticed before. He moved slowly through the living room, checking mail, folders, files, anything that could suggest she had prepared for something. Nothing obvious surfaced, but the unease in his gut tightened into something sharper. Certainty. Something was deeply wrong behind the clean narrative of her death. He returned to the kitchen table and set his phone down, staring at the screen until the message lit up again. I'm still alive. The words no longer stunned him. They ignited him. The grief that had nearly broken him at the funeral twisted into a new, fierce determination. If Grace had reached out, it meant she trusted him. And if she trusted him, he couldn't afford to falter. He wouldn't confront Daniel, not yet. He wouldn't alarm Megan. Not until he understood more. For now, he needed to move quietly, cautiously, exactly as the message instructed. Henry took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and whispered to the empty house, Grace, wherever you are, I'm coming. But as he turned off the kitchen light, a cold thought shadowed his resolve. Someone else might already be one step ahead of him. The next morning, the sky over Seattle hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that made the whole city feel muted and watchful. Henry drove slowly toward Grace's workplace, a 4-story tech office tucked between a coffee roastery and a row of glass-fronted consulting firms. The building looked the same as it always had, sleek, modern, sterile, but something in Henry's chest tightened as he parked. He hadn't been here since the annual holiday party. He could still picture Grace laughing with her team, offering him a plate of hors d'oeuvres, and teasing him for hovering near the exit. Now he walked through the front doors alone, the lobby too quiet, the air smelling faintly of burnt espresso and computer fan heat. A receptionist looked up, recognized him instantly, and her expression softened with pity. Mr. Lawson, I'm so sorry for your loss. Henry nodded stiffly. His loss. The phrase felt increasingly inaccurate. He stepped into the elevator, hands clasped behind his back to hide the tremor. The ride felt endless, each floor dinging like a countdown to something he couldn't name. When the doors finally slid open on the 3rd floor, he was met by a man already waiting for him. Henry, Elliot Brandt said warmly, stepping forward with the kind of sympathy that felt rehearsed. He wore an expensive suit, his hair styled perfectly, his smile gentle in a way that almost dared Henry not to believe it. I didn't expect you so soon. I'm truly sorry. Grace was one of our best. Losing her has been devastating for all of us. Henry offered a tight nod. I needed to see where she spent her last days. Of course, of course. Elliot motioned for him to follow down the hallway. If I can help in any way, please don't hesitate. They walked past open desks and hushed conversations. A few employees looked up, offering condolences, though some averted their eyes quickly, as if uncomfortable, or perhaps hiding something. Henry's attention drifted to those faces, the ones who avoided meeting him. He wondered what Grace had told them in her final weeks. When they reached her office cubicle, Elliot placed a steady hand on the back of Henry's arm. She was overworked, he said softly. Stressed, distracted. I kept telling her to take time off, but she was determined to carry the project on her shoulders. I wish she had listened. The words felt too smooth, too polished. Henry studied Elliot's face, searching for fractures in the performance. Grace didn't show any signs of stress at home, he said carefully. She never mentioned anything unusual. Elliot released a slow sigh, as if deeply burdened. She didn't want to worry you. You know how she was, always protecting everyone. She hid a lot of pressure from us, too. Something in the man's tone set Henry's nerves on edge. It was the casual confidence, the lack of hesitation. Grace had told Henry everything. Good, bad, even embarrassing. She wasn't someone who suffered in silence, and she certainly wouldn't hide serious stress from him. Henry stepped closer to her workspace. Her monitor was off, her chair pushed in neatly. A half-used notepad sat beside the keyboard, a pen resting diagonally across it, as though someone had left in a hurry. For a moment, he imagined Grace sitting there, glasses perched on her nose, tapping the pen against the pad as she worked through a problem. The image stabbed at him. "I'd like to take her personal items home," Henry said finally. "Notebook, picture frame, anything she kept here." Elliot hesitated, so briefly it might have been missed by someone less attentive. But Henry saw it, a flicker in the man's eyes, a pause in his breath. "Of course," Elliot said quickly, too quickly. "Let me gather a few things." He stepped away, heading toward his office. Henry watched him go, pulse thudding with the suspicion that something was being filtered, curated, cleaned. As he waited, a soft voice came from behind him. "Mr. Lawson?" Henry turned. A young woman, mid-30s, nervous eyes, stood near the printer station, glancing toward Elliot's closed door before stepping closer. She kept her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace trusted you," she said. "So, I think this is meant for you." She slipped a small sealed envelope into his hand. Her fingers trembled. "What is this?" Henry whispered. "I didn't open it," she murmured quickly. "She left it with me 2 weeks ago, told me to give it to you only if something happened." Henry's breath caught. His heart began to pound, steady and deep. "Why?" "I don't know," she said honestly. She looked scared, though. "And you should go before Elliot comes back." She stepped away, just as the office door down the hall opened. Henry tucked the envelope deep into his coat pocket, just before Elliot returned, with a half-filled box of Grace's belongings. "Here we go," Elliot said gently. "Her personal effects." Henry accepted the box with one hand, the other curling protectively around the envelope hidden at his side. He thanked Elliot, excused himself, and walked briskly to the elevator. Only when the doors closed did he slide the envelope open discreetly. Inside was a simple USB drive, black plastic, scratched on one edge. A small white label covered part of the casing. For H. Henry stared at it as the elevator descended, blood roaring in his ears. Whatever Grace had uncovered, whatever danger she had been running from, it was inside this drive, and he had no idea who might already be watching him take it home. The house felt colder than usual when Henry stepped inside, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to reveal what he carried hidden in his coat. He locked the door behind him, drew the blinds out of instinct, and set the small box of Grace's office items on the kitchen table. But it was the USB drive, light, silent, ominous, that he placed in front of him with deliberate care. He stared at it for a moment, a plain piece of plastic, barely the size of his thumb, yet somehow heavier than anything he had held since the funeral. The label, for H, felt like her voice, reaching across an invisible boundary, a secret she had saved only for him. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it to the study. He powered on the old desktop computer, listening to the familiar hum of the fan, the soft crackle of the screen waking to life. Everything around him felt faded and fragile, but the moment he inserted the drive, a jolt of adrenaline cut through the fog of grief. He braced himself. A folder named Private appeared instantly. He clicked it open. The first thing he saw was a spreadsheet, rows and columns filled with transaction records. His brows furrowed as he scrolled. Dozens of financial transfers, some large, some deliberately broken into smaller amounts, all tied to Grace's work account. But the dates didn't make sense. Some transfers were listed after office hours. Others appeared on evenings when Grace had been home with him, cooking dinner, or watching television with her feet curled beneath her on the couch. Henry leaned closer. These weren't mistakes. They were deliberate, and they bore Grace's digital signature. Only, they weren't hers. He clicked deeper. Several transfers routed through shell corporations, names he didn't recognize, but their final destination sent a chill directly into his spine. EB Consulting Group, EB, Elliot Brandt. Henry felt the air thicken around him. He scrolled further, pulse quickening as he found more connections. Internal approvals stamped with Grace's credentials, time-stamped emails she never wrote, digital fingerprints manufactured to make her appear responsible for money she had never touched. His jaw tightened. The grief lingering in his chest shifted, hardening, sharpening into something steadier. Grace hadn't been stressed because of overwork like Elliot claimed. She had been targeted. Someone was using her as the fall guy in a financial scheme big enough to bury her career, and maybe bury her entirely. Henry exited the spreadsheet and explored the rest of the files. A second folder contained documents she had gathered, including internal memos, code logs, and correspondence she must have quietly collected over time. Every piece pointed toward a cover-up. Every piece suggested she knew far more than she had ever admitted aloud. Then he saw the video file. His heart lurched. GREC1 MP4. He clicked it. The screen flickered, then steadied on Grace's face. Pale, tense, lit only by a dim lamp. She looked exhausted, but alert, her eyes darting off screen as though listening for something. And then she looked directly into the camera. "Henry," she whispered, "if you're seeing this, something is wrong." Henry froze. Her voice, familiar, trembling, alive, filled the quiet room like a ghost, pressing its hand against his chest. "I don't have long," she continued. "They're watching the accounts. They know I've found the discrepancies. Elliot, he's involved, but he's not the only one." She swallowed hard. "Someone higher up is using me as the scapegoat. They're moving money through my credentials. If this escalates, I could be arrested. Or worse. I just need time to figure out who the second person is." She glanced anxiously toward the door. "I'm leaving the cabin key with Linda. If anything happens, follow the files. Don't trust anyone until you understand the full picture. Not the company, not the police, not even..." She hesitated, voice breaking. "Not even the kids. You know how vulnerable Daniel is. If someone pressures him..." The recording cut abruptly, the frame freezing on her frightened eyes. Henry stared at the screen long after it turned black. His chest tightened with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. Grace had been terrified. She had been alone. And while he was at home, thinking her late nights were project deadlines, she was fighting to keep herself alive. His grief folded in on itself, reshaping into something colder, steadier, anchored by a resolve that settled deep in his bones. Someone had forced Grace into hiding. Someone had faked her accident. Someone had tried to erase her. And now that he had seen the evidence, that someone would expect him to crumble under the same fear. He closed the folder, removed the USB, and slipped it into his pocket. His next step was suddenly clear. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise. He would follow the trail she left. He would uncover everything. And whoever had pushed Grace into the shadows, they were about to learn that Henry Lawson was no longer grieving. He was hunting. But as he turned off the computer, a faint sound echoed from somewhere inside the house, soft, muffled, unfamiliar, pulling his pulse into a faster rhythm. He wasn't sure he was alone. The next morning, Henry drove toward the city impound lot, with the USB still weighing heavily in his pocket. The sky was a flat sheet of gray, and the air carried that sharp metallic smell that comes before rain. As the chain-link fence came into view, his fingers tightened around the steering wheel. This was where they had brought Grace's crashed car, the place that had supposedly held the last physical evidence of her death. He parked near the office trailer and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his shoes. A cold breeze swept through the open yard, carrying the hum of machinery and the occasional clang of metal. Rows of damaged vehicles stretched across the lot, crumpled fenders, shattered windshields, bent frames. But Henry's attention was fixed on the faint hope that Grace's car might tell the truth that no one else would. Inside the office, a bored-looking manager in a stained Seahawks hoodie glanced up from his paperwork. "Help you?" Henry cleared his throat, steadying himself. "I'm here about a vehicle, my wife's. Her car was brought in last week after the accident." He paused on the word, feeling it scrape the inside of his chest. "Grace Lawson, silver sedan." The manager typed lazily into the computer. "Lawson? Yeah, that one. Was here. Row C at the far end." He tossed Henry a visitor pass. "Be back before 12. Gate closes early today." Henry walked through the rows, scanning each section until he found the right lane. He expected to see catastrophic damage, the kind described in the official report. Twisted metal, a smashed-in front end, something that looked like it could have taken a life. Instead, he froze. Grace's sedan sat in the center of the row, looking almost untouched. The front bumper had a mild dent, the paint barely scraped. The windshield had a crack, yes, but not from a collision, more like a stray rock or a tool dropped during transport. The airbags were intact. The headlights were unbroken. The car looked like it had hit a parking post at low speed, not met its end on a highway. For a long moment, Henry simply stared, the disbelief washing through him in cold waves. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't even close to one. Someone had lied, cleanly, confidently, and with the certainty that no one would question it. He circled the car slowly, hands trembling as he touched the hood. The metal was smooth, unwarped. No signs of a violent impact, no reason for a fatality. "Grace," he whispered under his breath, "what did they tell them happened to you?" His jaw clenched. He moved to the office again, the anger simmering beneath his ribs. The manager was back at his counter, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. Henry approached with controlled calm. "I need to know who picked up my wife's car," he said. "It's not in the lot." The manager blinked lazily. "Huh? You didn't hear? It got taken out last night." Henry stiffened. "Taken out? By who?" The manager shrugged, tapping the side of his monitor. "Paperwork says the company. Didn't give a name. Just said someone authorized to retrieve it." Henry's pulse spiked. "What company?" Another shrug. "No idea. They didn't leave details. Guys come in all the time, pick up vehicles for insurance, contractors, corporate fleets. Look, I don't ask questions I don't need to. It was after hours anyway. They showed a badge, said they were here for the Lawson sedan, and we let it go." He didn't realize how tightly his hands had curled into fists until his knuckles ached. "And you didn't verify who they were?" The manager bristled slightly. "Sir, I follow the forms I'm given. If the system says release it, I release it. If something's wrong, take it up with the people who filed the request." Henry forced a slow breath. "Let me see that form." The manager clicked through screens, frowning. "Weird. Looks like the request file wasn't completed. Something cut off mid-entry." He scrolled, confused. "Huh, never saw that before." "Incomplete. Conveniently incomplete." Henry stepped back from the counter, the truth settling into him like heavy stones. Someone wanted that car gone. Someone with access. Someone who knew that if Henry or anyone else had seen how little damage there really was, the story of Grace's fatal crash would fall apart instantly. Elliot. The name rose in his mind like a flare. He saw again the way Elliot hesitated when Henry asked for Grace's office belongings, the way he spoke about her stress, the way he tried too hard to sound caring. Henry's grief shifted again, away from sorrow, away from numb confusion, into something with sharp edges and a single direction. Suspicion. Cold, heavy suspicion. He stepped out of the office and pulled his phone from his coat. His thumb hovered for only a second before tapping the contact he hadn't used in years. Detective Sarah Brooke. She answered on the third ring. "Henry, it's been a long time." "I need your help," he said quietly. "It's about Grace." There was a long pause. "Go on." "They lied about her accident, and I think someone's covering their tracks." He heard Sarah inhale sharply, professionalism quickly overriding surprise. "Where are you right now?" Henry looked back at the empty row where the car should have been. "At a place where the truth used to be," he said, "and someone made sure it disappeared." The diner was almost empty when Henry stepped inside, bell jingling faintly as the door shut behind him. The place hadn't changed in years. Same cracked red booths, same humming neon sign in the window, same scent of burnt coffee that clung to the air like a familiar memory. Sarah Brooke sat in the back corner, her badge tucked beneath a plain jacket, her posture alert even in the quiet morning lull. She rose when she saw him. "Henry," she said softly, and the sympathy in her eyes hit him harder than he expected. They hadn't spoken much since her investigation into a burglary at his warehouse nearly a decade earlier, but old respect lingered between them. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, sliding into the booth. "I heard about Grace." Sarah folded her hands. "I'm sorry, she was a good woman." Henry exhaled slowly and shook his head. "I don't think she's gone, Sarah." She blinked once, assessing him, not dismissing, just measuring. "Tell me everything." He pulled out his phone first, turning the screen so she could see the message. Her eyes narrowed as she read the words, "I'm still alive. Trust no one." She read them twice, then a third time, her jaw tightening. "Sent from her number?" she asked. "Same number, same timestamp as the funeral." Sarah leaned back, tapping her fingers thoughtfully against the table. She didn't say he was imagining things. She didn't question his sanity. She simply nodded for him to continue. Next, he produced the USB drive and the printed copies of the transferred funds he had pulled the night before. The spreadsheets, the memos, the routing numbers, all of it. She scanned each page with the precise, focused attention of someone trained to pick apart lies for a living. After several long minutes, she slid the final page aside. "These aren't accounting mistakes," she said. "This is structured, deliberate. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Henry watched her closely. "Fraud?" "Corporate level," she confirmed. "The transfers are staggered to avoid detection. Someone was laundering money through her credentials." Henry swallowed hard. Could Grace have known? Could she have found this before she disappeared? Sarah nodded slightly. "Looks like she did, and if she confronted the wrong person about it..." She let the sentence trail off, but Henry understood the implication. He felt it like a weight pressing into his spine. "She said her life was in danger," he murmured, "in the video on the drive." Sarah's expression sharpened. "Video?" He told her about the recording, Grace's strained voice, her fear, her mention of Elliot, and the warning about someone else involved. When he finished, Sarah's gaze drifted to the window, her mind visibly turning through the possibilities. Finally, she spoke. "Henry, listen carefully. If what you're saying is accurate, if the car was picked up without proper paperwork, if Grace left you this evidence, then you're stepping into something dangerous." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Play this wrong, and you'll be a target too." Henry met her eyes steadily. "I don't care about me. I care about finding her." "That's exactly why you need to be smart." Her tone was firm but not unkind. "You can't confront Elliot directly. You can't tell your kids. You can't alert anyone at the company. Whatever happened to Grace happened because she knew too much." His throat tightened. "Can you find her?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. "Officially, no. I can't even confirm she's alive without opening a case file, and if I open one, the wrong people could see it." She shook her head. "I need evidence that doesn't come from you, something I can verify independently." Henry felt the fragile spark of hope dim. "So, what can you do?" "Quiet work," she said. "Surveillance footage, toll booth scans, traffic cams. I can run a discreet search to see if Grace's car actually crashed where they said it did, or if it drove away after." She pointed to the paperwork he'd brought. "And I'll look into these transfers, off the record." Henry nodded slowly. "Thank you. But Henry..." Sarah's voice softened. "If she's alive, she's hiding for a reason. You need to be careful. Don't make sudden moves. Don't tip your hand. And don't assume everyone around you is clean." He knew exactly who she meant, Daniel. He didn't say the name aloud. The waitress refilled their coffees without interrupting. When she left, Henry rested his hands on the table, steadying himself. "I'm going to retrace her steps," he said quietly. "From her last day, from the hours before the accident. Someone saw her. Someone knows something." Sarah hesitated but didn't stop him. "Then keep me informed. And Henry?" He looked up. "Don't trust anyone until we know who's pulling the strings." He nodded once, pocketed the USB drive, and stepped out into the cold morning, with the sense that every step he took from this point forward was being watched. Henry parked in front of Linda Hart's modest blue bungalow, a place he and Grace had visited countless times over the years. The yard was tidy, the wind chimes on the porch clinking softly in the breeze. It should have felt familiar, comforting. Instead, as he climbed the steps, his stomach twisted with a tension he couldn't shake. Linda was one of the few people Grace trusted implicitly. If anyone knew what Grace was running from, it would be her. He knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. "Henry," Linda breathed, her face shifting from surprise to sorrow in a single beat. "I've been meaning to call you. I just didn't know what to say." Henry stepped inside, the scent of cinnamon tea drifting from the kitchen. "It's all right," he murmured. "There's something I need to talk to you about." She led him to the living room, where a knitted blanket lay draped over the couch, the same one Grace used to tease her about, calling it her comfort cape. Linda sat, clutching a tissue in one hand. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. Henry didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone, opened the message from Grace, and turned the screen toward her. Linda's reaction was immediate. Her breath hitched. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God. Henry, where did you get this?" "She sent it during the funeral," he said. "From her number." Linda's eyes went wide, panic blooming across her face like a crack spreading through glass. "No, no, no, Henry. She said this might happen. But I thought she was exaggerating or scared or—" She cut herself off, looking suddenly overwhelmed. Henry leaned forward, voice firm. "What did she tell you?" Linda hesitated, fingers twisting the tissue until it nearly tore. "Grace came to me about a month ago. She was jittery, looked over her shoulder a lot. She said someone at work was watching her, someone she couldn't get away from." A cold shiver crawled up Henry's spine. "She didn't tell me any of this." "She didn't want to worry you," Linda whispered. "She said you'd go straight to the police or confront someone, and she couldn't risk that. She thought if she stayed quiet, she'd figure out who was behind everything." Linda shook her head, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. But she was frightened, Henry. Truly frightened. The kind of fear she couldn't hide. Henry swallowed, his voice rough. "Frightened of who?" Linda wiped at her eyes. "She didn't say. Not at first." Henry waited. He could feel her holding something back. "She asked me for something," Linda continued faintly, "for the spare key to my cabin on San Juan Island." His breath stilled. "The cabin?" "She said she needed a place to think, somewhere off-grid, somewhere no one would look." Linda clasped her hands, regret flashing across her face. "I didn't ask questions. I should have, but she looked so desperate, so tired. I gave her the key the next day." "And she left? Just like that?" Linda nodded. "She told me she'd go alone, that she wouldn't stay long, but she didn't say when she'd return. She never called after that." Her voice trembled. "I thought maybe she was decompressing, trying to clear her head. And then the news about the accident came." Henry felt the room tilt slightly. Grace hadn't just disappeared. She'd planned an escape. She'd been hiding. And whatever she'd discovered at work was serious enough that she couldn't even trust her closest friends with the full truth. He forced his voice steady. "Linda, when she talked about someone being after her, did she say who it was? Anyone at all? A name? A warning?" Linda's eyes dropped to the floor. Her silence lingered too long. "Linda," Henry pressed gently but firmly, "please, I need to know." She looked up at him, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. She said, "It was someone close." Henry froze. "Close how?" he asked, his voice cracking more than he intended. "I don't know," Linda whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. She wouldn't explain. She just kept saying, "If anything happens, Henry needs to be careful. It's someone close." The words settled heavily between them, cold and suffocating. Henry felt his heart thud once, hard, as faces flashed through his mind. Daniel, Megan, Elliot, people within reach, people within trust. Linda reached for his hand, her grip trembling. "Henry." Whatever Grace was caught in, she didn't run from strangers. He nodded slowly, breath unsteady. He understood. Grace had run from someone who already had a key to her life, someone who should never have been a threat at all. Henry had barely stepped back into the house after leaving Linda's when he heard the sound of tires crunching against the driveway gravel. Fast. Too fast. He turned toward the front window, just as Daniel climbed out of his car, slamming the door harder than necessary. His son strode toward the house with a tension Henry recognized all too well, the kind that came from desperation. A cold ripple crept through Henry's chest. Daniel didn't knock. He pushed the front door open, calling out, "Dad?" Henry steadied himself. "In here," he said, stepping into the living room. Daniel walked in, his eyes darting around as though checking whether anyone else was there. His hair was uncombed, his jacket half-zipped, his expression wired with a nervous energy Henry hadn't seen since his teenage years. "You weren't answering your phone," Daniel said. "I've been calling." Henry forced a calm expression. "I was out. What's going on?" Daniel hesitated, just long enough for Henry to notice. Then he stepped closer. "I need to talk to you about Mom." The word tightened, something deep in Henry's lungs. "What about her?" Daniel's shoulders rose with a sharp inhale. "Her accounts, her savings, her work benefits." His voice was too casual, too rehearsed. "You've looked through them since the funeral, right? To get everything settled?" Henry kept his face still. Inside, his thoughts snapped to the message on his phone. Trust no one, not even the kids. Not even the kids. He swallowed carefully. "I haven't gone through anything yet," he lied. "I haven't had the strength." Daniel's eyes flickered. Disappointment, anxiety, something else entirely. "You should," he said quickly. "There might be things you need to take care of." "Like what?" Daniel shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Loans, policies, debts. I don't know. Her company might owe you something. You should check before they try to screw you over." Henry watched him closely. Daniel wasn't talking like a grieving son. He was talking like someone searching for a specific answer, something he expected Henry to already know. "Why the sudden concern?" Henry asked quietly. Daniel hesitated again. "Because..." He took a breath, choosing his words. "Because you and Mom always handled the financial side. I figured you'd want to make sure things didn't get lost." Then, softer, quieter, almost swallowed. "And I could use a little guidance, maybe even help." The truth cracked through. "Help?" Henry repeated. Daniel nodded, jaw tightening. "I'm in a rough spot right now. I made some investments that didn't pan out, and the bank's breathing down my neck. I just thought maybe Mom left something I could..." Henry cut him off gently, hiding the shock rippling through him. "Daniel, whatever problems you're having, we can talk about them, but your mother's accounts aren't the place to look." Daniel's expression hardened, the nervousness morphing into defensiveness. "I'm not trying to take anything from her. I'm just trying to survive." "Then tell me what you've gotten into," Henry said. "Let me help that way." Daniel looked away. "It's complicated. Try me." "I can't." Daniel's voice sharpened, frustration crackling under the surface. "You wouldn't understand." Henry's heart tightened. His son looked genuinely cornered, but that didn't make him innocent. Grace had warned him, someone close. Before he could respond, the front door opened again. "Dad?" Megan's voice carried into the room. She froze when she saw Daniel. "What are you doing here?" Daniel stiffened. "We're talking." "About what?" "None of your business," he snapped. Megan's eyes narrowed. She looked between Henry and Daniel, sensing something off instantly, her intuition as sharp as ever. "You don't just show up here out of nowhere and start interrogating Dad. What's going on?" "I'm not interrogating anyone," Daniel shot back. "I'm trying to figure out how to help." "Help?" Megan folded her arms. "Since when do you care about financial paperwork?" Daniel's face flushed with anger. "You always think the worst of me." "Because you hide everything," she said. "You've been acting weird for months. Now Mom's gone and you're suddenly desperate to know about her accounts? That's not normal, Daniel." "Shut up, Megan." "No," she said firmly. "Not until you explain why you're really..." Daniel's chair scraped violently as he stood. "Forget it. Forget all of this." He grabbed his coat. "If you won't help me, fine." His eyes flicked to Henry, hurt, fear, and something darker mixing together. "Just remember, you can't ignore reality forever." He stormed past Megan and out the front door, slamming it so hard the frame rattled. The house fell into a brittle silence. Megan turned to Henry. "Dad, what was he really asking you?" Henry looked at her worried eyes, her steady presence, and felt the crushing weight of Grace's warning settle over him again. He forced a weak smile. "Nothing important." But when she stepped away to make tea, Henry's gaze drifted toward the door Daniel had slammed. "Trust no one." The words echoed louder now, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he knew his own son at all. Henry didn't give himself time to overthink it. Once Megan left for the evening, once the house settled into that uneasy quiet that had begun to follow him everywhere, he packed a small bag, grabbed Grace's old sweater from the cedar chest, and slipped out the back door. The sweater was soft, worn at the sleeves, faintly scented with lavender. He hesitated before stuffing it into his bag, running his thumb over the faded stitching. She had worn it the night they first visited Linda's cabin years ago, laughing as the fairy wind tangled her hair. Now he carried it like a compass. The sky was already deepening to twilight when Henry reached the harbor. The ferry terminal lights buzzed overhead, casting long reflections across the dark water. He bought a ticket for the late sailing, a quiet run, mostly used by commuters heading home after long shifts. Perfect for keeping a low profile. He stepped onto the ferry just as the crew lifted the ramp. The engines rumbled beneath him as the vessel pulled away from the dock, the city lights shrinking into a scattered constellation behind him. Only a handful of passengers stood on the deck, an older couple taking photos, a man reading a newspaper, a teenager with headphones. Henry leaned against the railing, breathing in the cold, salt air, trying to steady the storm inside his chest. Every instinct he had told him this trip mattered. Linda had given Grace that spare key for a reason. The cabin was the only place she might have gone where eyes couldn't reach her. He reached into his bag and touched the sweater again, grounding himself. But after a few minutes, he felt it, an itch along the back of his neck, the sense of being watched. He turned casually, scanning the deck. A man stood near the stairwell leading to the car bay. Mid-40s, hood pulled low, hands in his pockets. Nothing outwardly threatening. But Henry had been watched before in his life. He knew the shape of it. The man wasn't looking at the water or the city. He was looking at him. Henry forced himself not to stare. He shifted position, pretending to admire the shoreline slipping past in the fading light. A moment later, he glanced back. The man quickly looked away. Paranoia? Maybe. But Grace's warning had rewired something inside him. Where he once offered trust easily, now he examined every shadow twice. Henry moved inside the cabin area, taking a seat near the window. The hooded man didn't follow, but Henry kept him in the corner of his vision through the glass. He remained near the stairwell, unmoving. The ferry ride felt longer than usual. The gentle sway, the hum of the engines, normally calming, only heightened his nerves. He rested one hand on the bag beside him, fingers brushing the fabric of Grace's sweater again, as though making sure it was still there. When the ferry finally slowed, approaching the island dock, Henry rose and joined the line of passengers preparing to disembark. He checked behind him. The man wasn't there. He scanned the deck, gone, simply disappeared. The absence didn't comfort him. He walked down the ramp onto the dimly lit dock. Only a few cars rolled off the ferry before it pulled away again, leaving behind a vast quiet, broken only by waves lapping against the pilings. The island always felt peaceful this time of night, but tonight its silence carried an unfamiliar edge. Henry tightened his coat and headed toward the forest path leading inland. The trail had always felt friendly with Grace beside him, her flashlight beam bouncing, her voice pointing out constellations through the treetops. But now the woods felt larger, darker. Branches creaked overhead as the wind slid through them, and damp earth muffled his footsteps. He walked for nearly 20 minutes, every crunch of leaves behind him making his shoulders tense. When the cabin finally came into view, partly hidden behind towering pines, Henry paused. Something was wrong. A faint glow pulsed from inside, light flickering irregularly, not steady like a lamp purposely left on. It looked like someone had been there recently, maybe still was. He stepped closer, heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. He could see the outline of the porch, the chair Grace used to drag outside on warm mornings. Now it sat slightly off-center, angled differently than he remembered. The flickering light brightened once, dipped again. Someone had been inside, maybe Grace, maybe someone looking for her. Henry gripped the strap of his bag, breath turning shallow as he approached the door, uncertain what or who he was about to find on the other side. The cabin door creaked open under Henry's cautious push, the hinges giving a soft groan that echoed into the dim interior. He paused on the threshold, listening. Nothing moved, only the low hum of the wind slipping through the gaps in the wooden siding. But the faint flicker of light he'd seen through the window was still there, coming from the small kitchen. He stepped inside. Warmth hit him first. Not emotional warmth, literal warmth. The cabin wasn't cold the way it should have been after sitting empty for months. Someone had been here recently, maybe even today. Henry's eyes adjusted slowly. The small table beside the window held two items that nearly buckled his knees: a loaf of fresh bread, still half wrapped, and a bowl of fruit that hadn't even begun to soften. On the couch, a neatly folded stack of blankets lay in a way that was unmistakably Grace. Tight corners, careful alignment, the same method she used at home. His heart hammered painfully. She had been here, not long ago. He moved into the kitchen, each step uncertain, afraid of breaking whatever fragile truth lingered in the air. Then he saw it, her favorite ceramic mug sitting on the counter. A pale blue mug with tiny speckles, the one she always insisted made tea taste warmer. A faint ring at the bottom suggested it had been used recently. Henry reached out and touched the mug with trembling fingers. It felt warm, only slightly, but undeniably warm. "Grace," he whispered, voice cracking. He turned slowly, scanning every corner of the cabin as if she might appear from the shadows. The small living room, the kitchen nook, the hallway leading to the bedroom. Everything looked lived in, not abandoned. A chair had been moved, a sweater draped over a hook, a towel drying near the wood stove. Henry's pulse throbbed in his ears as he stepped toward the back of the cabin. That was when he noticed it. The closet door at the end of the hall, not fully shut, just barely ajar, a sliver, a quiet invitation, or a warning. He approached slowly, hand braced against the wall for balance. When he nudged the door open, a soft glow spilled out, coming from a burner phone plugged into a portable charger on the floor. Henry felt a cold tremor crawl down his spine. A burner phone meant preparation, fear, escape. Grace had been hiding here intentionally. He crouched and picked up the phone, the screen lighting up instantly without a password. 3 messages sat at the top of the thread. "Stay hidden. They're watching your home." Henry's breath stilled as he read it again, the words sinking into him with icy precision. Someone knew where he lived. Someone knew he might go looking. Someone had been warning Grace, or directing her. He looked closer. The sender was an unknown number, unregistered, no name attached. A mix of relief and dread washed over him. Relief that Grace was taking steps to protect herself. Dread that whoever she trusted enough to text her was aware of threats circling their family. Henry set the phone down carefully, fighting the urge to call out her name again. Instead, he scanned the closet. Behind a stack of folded linens sat a black, spiral notebook. His breath hitched as he pulled it free. Grace's handwriting. He recognized the looping letters instantly, the way she dotted her I's with a small flourish. The first page was filled with dates, times, and fragments of sentences, notes hurriedly scribbled in what looked like fear and urgency. He flipped through the pages, reading phrases that tightened around his chest like a vice. Transfers don't match work logs. Elliot signing things on my behalf. Someone else is helping him, can't see who. If they find out, I know. The page after that ended with a pen stroke that dragged off the paper, as if she'd been interrupted mid-thought. Henry closed his eyes, pressing a shaking hand to his forehead. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't stress or confusion. Grace had been documenting a crime, a deliberate scheme, and she'd been running from the people involved. His fear deepened. Someone close, Linda had said. Someone Grace didn't dare name. He looked back at the burner phone, its dark screen reflecting his own expression, a blend of determination and terror. If Grace had been here, why wasn't she here now? He stood, clutching the notebook to his chest, and glanced around the cabin with a growing sense of unease. Nothing was overturned. Nothing suggested a struggle, but everything suggested departure. A quick one. He stepped toward the window, staring out into the tree line, the wind rustling through the branches like whispered warnings. Someone had been watching her home. Someone might be watching this cabin too. And Henry felt, with a sudden chilling certainty, that whoever was following Grace was closer than he'd ever realized. Night settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, thick and unmoving. Henry sat at the kitchen table long after the sun disappeared behind the trees, Grace's notebook open beside a half-finished cup of tea he'd reheated twice without drinking. The burner phone lay next to it, dark, silent, carrying warnings he couldn't forget. The cabin creaked occasionally the way old structures do, but Henry had grown up around cabins. He knew the difference between wood settling and something alive, moving through the night. What he heard this time wasn't the shifting of the frame or the groan of floorboards expanding in the cold. It was footsteps, soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakably human. Henry straightened in his chair, every muscle going rigid. He held his breath, straining to listen. There, another sound, a slow, cautious tread on the porch boards. Someone outside, someone trying not to be heard. The lamp beside him flickered, as if sensing the tension building inside the room. He stood slowly, pushing the chair back with the gentlest touch to avoid making noise. His pulse hammered hard and fast in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. After a brief hesitation, he reached for the old lantern hanging by the entryway, a heavy metal one Grace had insisted on keeping for emergencies. He didn't turn it on. He held it by the handle, gripping it tightly like a weapon. Another sound came, lighter, deliberate, right outside the kitchen window. Henry turned, breath stilled. A shadow glided across the glass, stretched and distorted by the moonlight slipping through the trees. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. The silhouette was too tall, too controlled. Someone was moving slowly along the side of the cabin, looking in, searching. His skin prickled, cold anxiety creeping across his arms as the shadow drifted past, then paused, right at the window where he had been sitting moments earlier. Henry pressed himself against the wall, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the faint outline beyond the window frame. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud enough that he worried the person outside could hear it too. A heavy footstep sounded next, then another. The shadow moved toward the front of the cabin. Henry tiptoed across the living room, each step measured, silent, the lantern still clutched tightly in his hand. He reached the entryway and stood behind the door, muscles tense, listening. The doorknob rattled, just a slight twist, but unmistakable. Someone was trying to enter. Henry pressed back against the wall, breath shallow, gripping the lantern so tightly his fingers ached. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't dare make a sound. If the person outside realized the cabin was occupied, they might push harder. They might already know he was inside. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Henry's pulse soared. Then, stillness. The quiet hung suspended, thick and suffocating. He could hear the faint whisper of the wind outside, the creak of the porch railing shifting under weight. He waited. 10 seconds, 20, a full minute. Then, footsteps retreating, slow, heavy, moving down the porch steps one at a time. Henry crept toward the window beside the door, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to see through. Moonlight cast a silver sheen across the clearing, but the trees swallowed most of the shadows. He couldn't see the person clearly, just movement. A faint shape slipping past the fire pit, blending into the tree line. Gone. Henry stayed frozen for several more seconds, listening for any hint that the stranger might return. When he finally exhaled, it trembled out of him in one jagged rush. He waited another full minute before unlocking the door as quietly as possible and stepping onto the porch. The air was icy, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The forest ahead was pitch black, silent, impenetrable. but the porch boards beneath his feet told a different story. Someone had definitely been standing here. He raised the lantern now and clicked it on. Its warm glow spilled across the porch, illuminating small details the moonlight had hidden. And there they were, fresh shoe prints. Not big, but not small either. Clear impressions in the thin layer of dirt and moss that covered the steps. The prints led from the path, across the porch, directly to the door, and then away again into the trees. They were crisp, recent. No rain had fallen to blur them. Someone had followed him from the ferry, or someone had been watching the cabin and moved in the moment they sensed activity. Henry crouched down, brushing his fingers near one of the prints without touching it. His breath fogged in the cold air. Someone had known he'd come. Someone had been looking for Grace, or for him. He stood slowly, lantern light trembling faintly in his hand as the reality settled like ice in his bones. He was no longer chasing shadows. The shadows were chasing him, and whoever had been at the door wasn't finished. Not yet. Henry barely slept after the footsteps. He sat in the cabin's living room, lantern dimmed to its lowest setting. Grace's notebook opened beside him like a lifeline. Every creak of the wood, every rustle outside pulled him upright. When dawn finally seeped through the window, thin and gray, it felt like a reprieve, temporary, fragile. He was checking the burner phone again when his own phone vibrated sharply in his pocket. The sudden sound made him flinch. Sarah Brooke. He answered immediately. Sarah? Her voice came tight, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent he'd never heard from her before. Henry, listen carefully. I found something. You need to hear this somewhere safe. He almost laughed at the irony. Define safe. Someplace where nobody else can hear you. Henry glanced around the empty cabin, the boarded windows, the blanket he'd pulled around his shoulders against the cold. Go ahead, Sarah exhaled. Your wife didn't die. The words struck him with a physical force. Even though he'd believed it since the funeral text, hearing it spoken, officially, concretely, sent a shock through him. You're sure? I'm not guessing, she said. Someone faked the accident report. I pulled traffic cam footage myself. Grace's car didn't crash. It drove past the reported accident site, untouched. No damage. She kept driving. Henry closed his eyes, relief and fear sweeping through him in equal measure. Where did she go? That's the concerning part, Sarah said. Footage from a gas station 2 miles from the supposed crash shows her parking behind the building. She got out, wearing a hooded jacket, and withdrew cash from an ATM. Large withdrawals, multiple banks, over the 3 days before she disappeared. Henry felt something twist in him, grief, pride, terror, all folding together. She was preparing, he whispered. She knew she had to run. Yes, Sarah said quietly, which means she also knew someone was after her, and I don't think she trusted anyone to protect her. Henry's jaw tightened. The official report said there was a witness. There wasn't, Sarah said. At least not a real one. The name on the statement leads nowhere. No phone, no address, not in our systems. Someone forged it. The cabin seemed to tilt slightly. Henry braced a hand against the table. Someone wanted the world to believe she died. And they did a good job, Sarah said. Too good. This wasn't sloppy fraud. The paperwork was polished. The timestamps matched. Whoever filed it knew exactly how to keep questions from being asked. He swallowed hard. Elliot. I think so too, but he's not the only one. Sarah paused. Grace was in deep. Those transfers you showed me, the structure suggests at least 2 people had access to her credentials. 2 distinct patterns, and the second one is more cautious, smarter. Henry rubbed his forehead, breath shaky. Grace wrote about someone helping him, someone she never saw. I believe it, Sarah said, and I think that someone filed the witness statement. The wind rattled the cabin siding, making Henry turn instinctively toward the window. He lowered his voice. Sarah, someone was here last night. Where? The cabin, footsteps. Someone tried the door. They followed me. A sharp inhale came through the phone. Henry, you need to be extremely careful. If they know you're looking into this, you're not just a bystander anymore. You're involved. He nodded, though she couldn't see it. His mind was already racing. Grace's messages, the burner phone, the missing car, the footsteps, and Daniel. He hesitated, the words forming reluctantly. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about my son." Her tone shifted, sharpening with attention. "Go on?" "He came to the house, asking about Grace's accounts, her savings. He's in debt. He was desperate. And he's been talking with Elliot." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, loaded with calculations. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Henry, listen to me very carefully." He braced himself. "You need to watch everyone, even family." Henry's throat tightened painfully. He wanted to argue, to defend his son, to insist Daniel would never harm Grace, but the words wouldn't come. Not after the tension in Daniel's eyes, not after the hidden debt, not after the warning Grace herself had written. "I don't want to believe he's involved," Henry whispered, "but I can't ignore what I've seen." "You shouldn't," Sarah said firmly, "but don't confront him, not yet. If he's part of this, even accidentally cornering him could push him into someone else's hands, or worse." Henry exhaled, shaky and slow. "What do I do now?" "Retrace Grace's last known movements," Sarah said. "Follow the ATM withdrawals. Check the places she went. I'll dig into the financial logs and surveillance. Quietly. And if someone's already watching me?" "Then you stay one step ahead," Sarah replied, "and you don't trust anyone who gives you a reason to doubt." The call ended, leaving Henry alone with the fading echo of her warning. He set the phone down, watched the shadows shift outside the window, and understood. Grace wasn't the only Lawson someone was hunting. The morning light in the cabin was thin and watery, barely breaking through the dense canopy outside. Henry sat at the small wooden table with Grace's black spiral notebook in front of him. He had skimmed pieces of it the night before, but exhaustion and fear had blurred the lines together. Now, in the gray hush of dawn, he opened it with the reverence of someone touching a final letter from a loved one. The first pages were frantic, scrawled dates, arrows pointing between numbers, shorthand notes he recognized from years of watching Grace organize household budgets. But beneath the familiar handwriting lay a tension he'd never seen in her before. Her letters leaned sharply, ink pressed hard enough to indent pages underneath. He turned to the next page. "Elliot's transfers don't match the company logs, not just rounding errors, full amounts rerouted." Henry felt his jaw tighten. He remembered standing in Elliot's office, the man's too polished concern, the subtle hesitation when Henry asked for Grace's desk items. He had suspected something then. Now he knew. Grace had written more. 2 signatures used, mine and someone else's. Can't tell who. Patterns differ. Someone feeding him access from inside. Henry traced her handwriting with his thumb. He could almost hear her voice. Low and urgent, speaking as she wrote, someone helping him. Sarah had reached the same conclusion, and whoever that second person was, they were smarter, leaving fewer traces, hiding behind the illusion of routine transactions. Henry flipped another page. "If they find out I noticed, they'll pin it on me. Someone's setting me up. Need to get ahead of it." The words hit him like a weight. Grace hadn't been paranoid. She'd been hunted. She'd been watching the walls of her life close in without anyone else seeing the tightening circle. "Elliot cornered me after work, asked if I'd been reviewing the reports." His tone changed, too calm, like he already knew the answer. Henry inhaled sharply. The idea of Elliot intimidating her, pushing her into fear, twisted fury inside him. Grace was brilliant, perceptive, strong, and yet she had been forced into silence. He turned another page. "I confronted him indirectly, said the numbers looked off. He said I should let the accountants handle it. Then he locked his office door." Henry's pulse quickened. Even reading the words, he felt the threat radiating off the page. "He said mistakes happen when we're tired." He smiled. "I didn't believe a word." Henry imagined that smile, the one Elliot had used on him at the office, the one that never reached his eyes. Next page. The writing grew tighter, more hurried. "I checked the internal logs later. Same discrepancies. Worse. Someone is building a case with my credentials. They want it to look like I stole the money." Henry clenched the edge of the notebook so hard the spiral rings dug into his skin. He pictured Grace discovering this alone, night after night in her cubicle, piecing together a conspiracy that threatened everything she had built. Then came the words that nearly stopped his breath. If they file charges before I can prove what's happening, I'll lose everything. Henry will lose everything. I can't let that happen. He felt his throat tighten. She hadn't been protecting herself. She'd been protecting him, their home, their savings, their life. She'd seen the trap forming before anyone else did. He turned the page. If I disappear for a while, it might keep them from finishing the setup. If they can't find me, they can't arrest me. Maybe it buys time. Disappear. She had chosen to vanish rather than let anyone drag him into the fallout. Linda's cabin is off the grid. Good place to think, to gather evidence. Might need the spare key soon. Another piece fell into place. Linda's panic, her hesitance, her quiet guilt. Grace had come to her, frightened but determined. Then Henry reached the final written page. Grace's handwriting had shifted again, faster, slanted, almost frantic. I think they know I'm looking into this. Saw someone near the house last night. Same car that's been parked outside work. Elliot isn't working alone. Someone else. Someone closer. The sentence stopped, mid-word, mid-pen stroke. A jagged line dragged downward where her hand must have slipped. The ink smudged at the bottom, as if the notebook had been closed in a hurry. Henry stared at the abrupt silence on the page, the way the sentence hung unfinished, as though the truth had been yanked out of her hand before she could write it. He felt a cold ache bloom in his chest. Grace had been interrupted. Something, or someone, had forced her to stop writing, forced her to flee before she could warn him fully. The burner phone, the warm blankets, the fresh food. She had been here, living in fear, gathering evidence. But she hadn't planned to stay. Henry closed the notebook slowly, palms trembling. She was still moving, still running, still trying to stay one step ahead of the people who wanted to erase her. He looked around the cabin, at the signs of her brief presence. She hadn't just disappeared. Grace was out there somewhere. And the danger that chased her was getting closer. Henry met Sarah in the back booth of a small cafe tucked beneath the Aurora Bridge, a place so out of the way that no one ever ended up there by accident. Rain pattered against the windows in thin, cold streaks, muting the sound of passing traffic. Sarah arrived 5 minutes after he did, her hair damp from the walk, coat zipped tight. "You picked a quiet place," she said as she slid into the booth. "That's the point," Henry replied. He kept his voice low. "I don't know who followed me to the cabin, but someone did." Sarah didn't flinch. She simply nodded, pulled out a folder from her coat, and set it between them. "Then, let's move quickly." Henry's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" Sarah flipped open the folder. Inside were printed ATM logs, timestamps, and small grayscale stills from various security cameras. She tapped a page with her pen. Grace started making cash withdrawals 3 days before her supposed death. Small amounts. Nothing that would trip an automatic fraud alert. Henry leaned closer. "Why withdraw in pieces instead of one large amount?" "To stay off radar," Sarah said. "Large pulls get flagged. Multiple small ones only get noticed if someone is looking for them, which her company wasn't." She drew a thin red circle around the first withdrawal. "Here, Harborview Ferry Terminal, the night before the fake crash." Henry stared at the still image. Grace in a hooded jacket, head down, her hair tucked inside the collar. But he recognized the way she held her shoulders, slightly turned inward when she was nervous. "She was preparing early," he murmured. Sarah nodded and moved to the next page. Another withdrawal at the Bremerton Ferry kiosk, then one at a rural grocery store on Whidbey Island, then a gas station on the eastern side of the Kitsap Peninsula. Henry frowned. "It's like she's circling the water." "Exactly," Sarah said. "Not leaving the region, but never staying still, moving between rural stores and ferry ports, places where cameras are outdated or too far apart to track movement clearly." Henry swallowed. She didn't want to be found. She didn't want them to find her. Sarah leaned back, scanning his face. This pattern, moving around islands, sticking close to water roots, it's smart. Really smart. Hard for anyone without direct surveillance access to follow. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, relief mixed with dread. So she's alive. She was hiding intentionally. The notebook, the burner phone. And the withdrawals, Sarah finished. Everything she did lines up. This isn't a frantic escape. It's controlled. Careful. Henry exhaled shakily. But then who came to the cabin? Who tried the door? Sarah hesitated before answering. I think Elliot knows she's alive. Henry's grip on the edge of the table tightened. How? Because you're not the only one retracing her steps, she said. Someone else is following the same money trail. Someone with resources. And Elliot fits that profile, but... She tapped her pen twice against the folder. He's not operating alone. Henry stared at her, dread creeping back in. Grace wrote the same thing. Yes, and the secondary patterns in the financial logs you showed me? I cross-referenced them. 2 distinct signatures, 2 people accessing her credentials. Henry's stomach twisted. The second person, the one she didn't recognize. Sarah watched him carefully. Do you have any idea who that could be? He hesitated. The memory of Daniel standing in his kitchen playing like a loop in his mind, his frantic eyes, the pointed questions about Grace's accounts, the panic in his voice he tried to hide, and underneath it, the debt, the secrecy. I don't know, Henry said quietly. But Daniel's been acting strange. He came to the house. He wanted information about her finances. He's in deeper trouble than he admitted. Sarah didn't look surprised. She simply folded her hands. You think he's involved? I don't want to, Henry whispered, throat tightening. But Grace warned me. Someone close. And Daniel has been hiding things. Sarah leaned forward, her voice softening. Henry, listen to me very carefully. He looked up. If Daniel is involved, even accidentally, the worst thing you can do is confront him right now. Henry felt himself tense. I can't just ignore it. You have to, she insisted. If he's acting under pressure, you corner him, and he'll run straight to whoever is pulling his strings, or he'll panic and do something reckless. Henry swallowed. The truth of her words settled heavy in his chest. Daniel wasn't strong under fear. If someone had targeted him, manipulated him, he could be unknowingly dragging Grace into deeper danger. What do I do then? Henry asked. Keep watching. Keep your distance. Let me keep digging. Sarah closed the folder. We'll follow Grace's trail until we find where she went last, and in the meantime, you stay quiet. No sudden moves, no confronting anyone. The rain outside intensified, streaking down the windows in relentless lines. Henry stared at the folder between them. The thin trail of Grace's last days laid out in grainy stills and timestamps. She was out there somewhere, still moving, still hiding, still running. And now Henry knew, for certain, that the people chasing her were closing in, and one of them might be sitting at his family table. Henry waited until after dusk before driving to Daniel's apartment. He didn't call ahead, didn't warn him, didn't give himself the chance to turn back. He simply drove, hands locked on the wheel, stomach heavy, Sarah's warning echoing in his mind. Watch everyone, even family. The apartment complex sat on the edge of downtown, half renovated and overpriced. Henry parked across the street, watching the windows for a long moment before heading in through the side entrance. The hallway smelled faintly of paint and old carpet. Light buzzed overhead. The quiet felt loaded. He knocked once. Daniel opened the door quickly, as if he'd been pacing, waiting, anxious. His eyes widened. Dad? What are you doing here? Henry forced a simple smile. Thought I'd check on you. Daniel blinked, thrown off, but stepped aside. Yeah, sure, come in. Henry entered slowly, scanning the apartment with the trained eye of a man who'd spent decades reading warehouses, rooms, human behavior. Daniel had never been tidy, but the mess wasn't what caught Henry's attention. It was the electronics. A new flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, a gaming system he knew Daniel couldn't afford. 2 unopened boxes on the counter, one a high-end drone, the other a pair of noise-canceling headphones still sealed in plastic. Expensive. Too expensive. Daniel followed his gaze and stiffened. It's not what you think. I haven't said anything, Henry replied calmly. Daniel swallowed. Most of it was on sale. Henry didn't answer. He walked further in. Daniel's nervous energy filled the room, the shifting feet, the jittery fingers tapping against his leg, the way he kept glancing at his phone on the coffee table. Henry picked up the device. Dad, don't... A notification lit up the screen before Henry even touched it. A text preview. Elliot Brandt. Any update on Grace? The words stared back at both of them, silent and sharp. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing the phone from Henry's hand, but the damage was done. Henry stepped back, chest tightening, grief rising like a tide. So it's true, he said quietly. You've been talking to him. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like bracing for an impact. Dad, I can explain. Henry's voice cracked. Explain what? Why the man who lied about your mother's death is texting you? Why you're acting like you owe him something? Daniel's shoulders sagged. It's not like that. Then what is it like, Daniel? Henry asked. Because right now, it looks a hell of a lot like betrayal. Daniel's breath shook. Elliot offered to help me. He knew I was struggling. He said he could make some things go away. Henry stared at him. Debts. Daniel didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Henry sank onto the edge of the couch, feeling the weight of the room press down on him. How did he even know you were in debt, Daniel? Did you tell him? Daniel shook his head weakly. No, he knew. I don't know how, but he knew everything. He said Mom was making mistakes at work, and someone needed to make sure it didn't ruin her, and us. Henry's jaw tightened. And you believed him? Daniel paced, rubbing his face with both hands. He said Mom had gotten involved in something she couldn't control, that she put the family at risk, that if I helped him clean up the mess, he'd pay me enough to start fresh. Henry felt something inside him break. Daniel, he whispered, your mother was trying to protect you. She was running from people who wanted to frame her. And you helped the man doing it. I didn't know, Daniel snapped, voice cracking under the pressure. I didn't know it was that serious. I thought it was just financial stuff. I thought Mom messed up and Elliot was trying to fix it quietly. He made it sound like she needed help. Help? Henry echoed, stunned. By spying on her? By telling Elliot where she was? By asking me about her accounts? Daniel's face crumpled. I didn't know they'd use it against her, I swear. Dad, you have to believe me. I didn't know it would go this far. Henry stood slowly, the ache in his chest sharper than anger. Daniel, your mother trusted you more than anyone, if she knew you were talking to Elliot. He shook his head, unable to finish. Daniel's breath stuttered. Dad, please. Henry looked at him, his son, his blood, and felt the full weight of Grace's warning settle like stone in his gut. Someone close. Daniel wasn't malicious. He wasn't cruel. But he was weak, vulnerable, easily manipulated. The perfect target for someone like Elliot. I never meant to hurt her, Daniel whispered. I didn't know who else to turn to. Henry stared at him, seeing not the boy he raised, but the man caught in someone else's web. A man who had already stepped too far into danger. And Henry understood. Whatever part Daniel had played, it wasn't over. In the silence that followed, the buzzing of the refrigerator sounded louder than either of them could bear. Finally, terrified, Daniel looked up. Dad, what do we do now? Henry didn't answer. Not yet, because he finally understood. Grace wasn't just running from Elliot. She'd been running from what Elliot had turned Daniel into, and Henry had no idea how deep his son was already trapped. The sky was only beginning to lift from black to pale blue when Henry stepped off the first ferry of the morning. Dawn air cut sharp against his skin, carrying the scent of saltwater and fir trees. He had driven straight from Daniel's apartment to the terminal without sleeping, without even stopping to think, because thinking hurt. Thinking replayed Daniel's confession, his trembling voice, the breadcrumb trail of mistakes he'd fallen into. Thinking always circled back to Grace, and the question he feared more than any other, was he already too late? Now, As he walked the familiar dirt path toward the cabin, everything inside him tightened. The woods were quieter than usual, as if listening. The trees stood tall and still. Even the birds hadn't begun their morning chatter yet. A hush clung to the air, heavy, expectant. As the cabin came into view through the thinning branches, Henry stopped mid-step. There was movement inside, not shadows, not tricks of light. A person, a figure passing slowly across the front window, silhouetted by the dim interior glow he hadn't left on. His breath caught. For a few heartbeats, he couldn't move. He stepped forward, one careful foot after another. His pulse pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. The closer he got, the more details he made out. The slight slump of shoulders, the slow, hesitant pacing near the counter. Then, as if sensing him, the figure moved toward the door. Henry froze. The latch clicked. The door opened, and Grace stepped into the doorway. Thin, pale, trembling, alive. For a second, Henry forgot to breathe. The world narrowed to a single point. The woman he had buried in a coffin, the one he had cried for, the one he'd mourned, the one he'd fought to find. She stared at him as if she weren't sure he was real. "Henry," she whispered, her voice cracking. He stepped forward just as her knees buckled. She fell into him, her arms weak but desperate as she clutched at his coat. Henry wrapped both arms around her, supporting her weight, holding her as if she might vanish again if he blinked too long. "Oh God, Grace." His voice fractured, breaking open from a place he didn't know how to protect. He pressed his cheek against her hair, breathing in the faint, familiar trace of lavender and cold air. "You're alive. You're alive." Grace tried to speak, but a sob twisted out instead, her body shuddering against his. Henry lifted her gently, guiding her back inside the cabin, where warmth still lingered from the small fire burning in the stove. He set her on the couch, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. She looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, cheeks hollow, hands shaking uncontrollably. But she was here. That was enough to make Henry's vision blur. Grace grabbed his wrist weakly. "I didn't know if you'd find me," she whispered. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again." "You should have called me," Henry breathed. "You should have trusted me." A flicker of guilt broke through her expression. "I couldn't. They were watching the house, watching the office. If I'd brought you in, if I'd told you more, you would have been in danger." Henry swallowed hard. "You disappeared. Grace, I thought you were dead." "I had to make them think that," she said quietly. "It was the only way to stay ahead of them." Henry sat beside her, his hand still wrapped in hers, his voice cracking. "Tell me everything. All of it." Grace nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "I found the full scale of the fraud. Not just little discrepancies, millions. Someone was siphoning money from the startup, routing it through shell companies. I traced several transfers to Elliot. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore." Henry's jaw clenched. "I knew he was involved. But he wasn't alone." Grace's eyes darkened with fear. There were two of them, Elliot and someone he only ever called the partner. I never saw the second person. I only saw their trail, signatures in the logs, access patterns, changes in files after I left work. Henry felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Daniel's pale face flashed through his memory, but he forced the thought aside. Not yet. Not here. Grace continued, voice shaking. "When I confronted Elliot, he told me I was making mistakes. He smiled, Henry. He smiled like he already owned the truth. Later that night, I saw the same car parked outside the house that had followed me from work. I knew they were going to frame me. I knew I had no time." "So you staged my death," she finished softly. "The crash was set up. I left the car at the fall site and walked away before they could follow. I withdrew cash wherever I could. I moved constantly." Henry closed his eyes as her words sank in. "Grace, they almost killed you." "They would have," she whispered, "if they'd found me." The fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a distant warning. Henry took her hand, squeezing it firmly. "You're not alone anymore. I found you, and we're ending this. Together." Grace looked at him, tears shining in her tired eyes. "Henry, they won't stop." "Neither will I," he said, steady and certain. And somewhere deep in the forest, beyond the cabin walls, a branch snapped. Sarah arrived at the cabin just after sunrise, her unmarked SUV rolling quietly up the gravel path. She stepped out with the purposeful calm Henry remembered from her detective days, but the moment she saw Grace alive, the composure slipped. Her eyes widened, shock, relief, everything at once. "Grace," Sarah breathed. I can't believe—" "No time," Grace said, voice thin but steady. "They're close. We have to move." Henry stood beside her, one hand gently on her back, grounding her. Sarah's gaze shifted between them, recalibrating. Then she nodded once. "All right, let's end this." Inside the cabin, the three sat around the small kitchen table, Grace wrapped in a blanket, Sarah spreading out her notes, Henry watching both of them with a gaze hardened by sleepless nights and too many revelations. Sarah began. "We need evidence that ties Elliot directly to the fraud. Enough to trigger a full investigation before he realizes we're onto him, and we need him in a controlled environment." Grace swallowed. "So, you're saying I have to reach out?" Henry bristled immediately. "Absolutely not. He's dangerous." "Henry," Grace said quietly, turning toward him, "he already thinks he won. If he believes I'm ready to give up, he'll come to me, and that's the only way to catch him." Sarah added, "We'll protect her. I'll have undercover units in place. Audio, visual, everything we need. But the bait has to look real." Henry hated this. Every instinct screamed to keep her hidden, safe, far from Elliot's reach. But Grace met his eyes, her voice softening. "We finished this together, remember?" He finally nodded, though the fear didn't leave him. Sarah slid a burner phone across the table. "Use this. Send a message that looks desperate, something that convinces him you want out. No mention of the evidence, no accusations, just surrender." Grace took the phone with trembling fingers. She typed slowly, reading the words aloud under her breath. "Elliot, I can't run anymore. I want to make things right. Tell me where to meet." She hesitated before pressing send. Henry placed a steadying hand on hers. She looked at him, then hit the button. The message whooshed out. Before anyone could speak, the phone buzzed sharply. A reply. Sarah leaned in. "Elliot. Good. Meet me. Alone. Now." Henry felt his jaw clench. "Too fast," he muttered. "He's been waiting." Sarah's expression darkened. "And he thinks he's in control." Perfect. They arranged the meeting point quickly, an old warehouse on the mainland where Sarah could position her undercover officers without drawing suspicion. The location had multiple exits, old security lights, and enough empty space for surveillance. Henry insisted on coming. Sarah refused. "You're too emotionally involved," she told him. "If he sees you, everything collapses." Grace touched Henry's arm gently. "I'll be okay." He didn't believe that, but he let her go. Hours later, the operation was in motion. Undercover cars tucked behind loading bays, officers disguised as maintenance workers, Sarah giving crisp orders through a concealed earpiece. Grace stood near the entrance, pale but composed, hands tucked into her coat pockets to hide their shaking. Sarah stayed just behind her, out of sight, but close enough to intervene. Then a figure appeared, but it wasn't Elliot. It was Daniel. He stumbled toward Grace, breathless, panicked, eyes wide with terror. Mom, what are you doing? You can't be here," Elliot said. "He told me." Henry watched from a distance with Sarah's team, shock tightening every muscle in his body. Grace's face changed, from fear to heartbreak to something deeper, sharper. "Daniel," she said, stepping forward, voice trembling with fury and grief. "You betrayed your own mother." Daniel's face crumpled instantly. "I didn't mean to," he burst out. "I swear, I didn't know he— Mom, I thought he was helping me. I thought he was helping you. He said you were ruining everything, that you were going to lose the house, that— Daniel." Grace's voice cracked. "He used you." Daniel shook violently, tears streaking down his face. "He told me to keep him updated. He said if I did, he'd take care of my debt. I didn't know he would fake your death. I didn't know he'd try to hurt you. I didn't know." His words dissolved into choked sobs. Grace stared at him for a long, aching moment. The hurt in her eyes was deeper than anything Henry had ever seen. She reached out, gripping her son's trembling shoulder. "Daniel," she whispered, "he manipulated you because you were scared. But you have to be brave now. You have to help us stop him." Daniel nodded frantically. "I'll do anything. I just want you safe." Before Grace could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Heavy, intentional. Sarah tensed. Henry's stomach dropped. Grace stiffened, stepping instinctively in front of Daniel. The sting operation had just shifted, and Elliot was finally coming into view. The warehouse sat like a forgotten skeleton on the edge of the old industrial district. Rusted beams, broken windows, concrete floors cracked from years of neglect. Grace stood near the center of the cavernous space, her breath fogging in the cold air, her body tense but upright. She kept her hands in her coat pockets, hiding the tremor she couldn't control. Sarah's voice whispered in her earpiece, low and steady. "We have eyes on all exits. Stay where you are. We're recording." Grace swallowed hard. "Copy." Footsteps echoed across the concrete, slow, confident. Grace turned as Elliot Brandt emerged from the shadows with a smile sharpened into something predatory. "Well," he said, spreading his arms as if greeting an old friend, "you finally came to your senses." Grace fought the urge to step back. "You told me you could fix this. You told me there was still a way out." Elliot's smile widened. "There is, but not here. Not in this country." He took another step closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, Grace. You disappear for real this time, permanently, and everything goes away. No charges, no investigations, no questions." She stared at him, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. "Leave the country? That's your solution?" "It's the only one," Elliot said with practiced certainty. "I can wire you enough money to restart somewhere quiet, but if you stay, if you talk to anyone, everything burns. You, me, the company, everyone." From behind a stack of crates, hidden microphones captured every word. Sarah's team, positioned in the rafters and behind broken walls, exchanged silent nods. The recording was crisp, clean, gold. Grace held Elliot's gaze. "You framed me." Elliot chuckled softly. "Frame is such an ugly word. I diverted suspicion, that's all. You were already under pressure. It made sense." Grace forced her voice steady. "You faked the accident report." Elliot waved a hand dismissively. "Please, that wasn't hard. A car in the right spot, the right person signing off on the file. You know how simple it is to push a story through the system?" His tone carried a smirk. "The crash report was flawless." Above them, Sarah stiffened. Her hand moved to her radio. "We got it," she whispered. "He just confessed." Grace felt her stomach flip, but she kept her face neutral. "Why involve Daniel?" she asked, voice quieter now, rawer. "Why use my son?" Elliot sighed. He was convenient, desperate. People like that do exactly what they're told. The words had barely left his mouth when another voice rang across the warehouse, shaking, furious, unrestrained. "You lied to me!" Elliot spun around. Daniel stumbled into the open space, eyes red, chest heaving as if he'd run through half the city to get here. Henry and Sarah's team startled. This was not part of the plan. Henry had slipped in through the side entrance minutes earlier, unable to stay away when he heard Daniel had fled the staging area. He now stood frozen behind a stack of crates, helplessly watching his son unravel. Daniel pointed at Elliot with a trembling hand. "You said Mom was the problem. You said she stole money, that she needed help, that you were protecting us." Elliot's face drained of color. "Daniel, you used me," Daniel's voice cracked. "You made me call Dad, dig for information, track her. You said she was unstable, that she was ruining everything." "Shut up," Elliot snapped. "No." Daniel's voice echoed through the warehouse. "You never cared about helping us. You were covering your own tracks." Grace stepped forward, tears stinging her eyes as she looked at her son. Terrified, broken, finally seeing the truth. Daniel. He looked at her, overwhelmed. Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Elliot's eyes darted wildly toward the exits. His composure cracked. This wasn't the deal. You weren't supposed to bring him. You weren't supposed to... He lunged backward, turning toward the nearest loading door. Sarah's voice snapped through the warehouse. Move in. Now. Undercover officers emerged from every corner, shouting commands, weapons raised but controlled. Elliot bolted, shoving past a stack of pallets and sprinting toward the sunlight, cutting through the broken doorway. But he didn't make it 2 steps outside before uniformed officers closed in from both sides. One tackled him cleanly onto the pavement, another cuffed his wrists. Elliot's protest dissolved into a strangled curses as he was hauled upright. Inside the warehouse, Daniel dropped to his knees, sobbing. Grace rushed to him, pulling him into her arms as he shook, guilty and relieved all at once. Henry finally emerged from hiding, breath shuddering as he watched his wife and son clinging to each other, a moment he'd feared he'd never live to see. Sarah approached Henry, her expression equal parts triumph and exhaustion. It's over, she said quietly. But Henry looked past her, toward the open doorway where Elliot had been taken down. No, he murmured, voice tightening with a new weight. Not yet. The next 48 hours moved with a speed Henry hadn't felt since his working years. Urgent, chaotic, unstoppable. Once Elliot was dragged from the warehouse floor, the truth finally began to unwind, thread by thread, into something undeniable. By morning, Sarah called Henry with the first update. Elliot's been formally charged, she said, her tone steadier than he'd ever heard it. Corporate fraud, falsifying crash records, coercion, and that's just the beginning. Every hour we dig, another lie surfaces. Henry stood in the hospital hallway outside the small evaluation room where Grace was giving her written statement. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So, it's really happening. It is, Sarah replied. He's facing years, maybe decades. Inside the room, Grace sat with an investigator, her voice thin but resolute as she retold the story she had survived. The forged signatures, the altered logs, the pressure, the stalking, the night she realized she had to disappear to stay alive. Her hands shook as she talked, but she didn't falter. Every truth she'd been forced to swallow in silence was finally finding air. When she finished, she caught Henry's eye through the glass window. He offered her a small nod, quiet, steady, unshakable. She smiled faintly before turning back to the investigator. Down the hall, Daniel sat with a different officer, shoulders hunched, hands clasped between his knees. He looked smaller than Henry remembered. Softer, stripped of all the bravado he'd used to survive the past months. Sarah stepped over to Henry's side. He's cooperating, she said gently. Told us everything Elliot asked him to do. Every meeting, every call, every lie he was fed. Henry's jaw tensed. Is he going to jail? Sarah shook her head. No, he was manipulated, and he came clean. That counts. He'll face financial oversight, mandatory counseling, maybe community service, but not prison. Henry exhaled, partly relieved, partly aching. His son had walked the edge of something that could have destroyed him, and them. Inside the small interview room, Daniel looked up, his eyes red and swollen. For the first time since this nightmare began, Henry saw the boy he used to carry on his shoulders, the boy who trusted too easily, felt too deeply, and panicked when life pushed too hard. Daniel mouthed 2 silent words. I'm sorry. Henry nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. When Grace finally emerged from her testimony, she looked exhausted, her body leaning slightly against the wall for balance. Henry walked straight to her and lifted her hands into his. It's over, she whispered. Almost, he corrected gently, but you don't have to run anymore. Grace closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against his. I missed you, she breathed, every hour, every night in that cabin. I thought I'd never see you again. You fought your way back, Henry murmured. You saved yourself. I just followed your trail. Before Grace could answer, footsteps hurried toward them. Megan rounded the corner at a full run, breathless, eyes red from crying. "Mom!" she choked. Grace barely had time to open her arms before Megan collided into her, hugging her so tightly the blanket around Grace's shoulders slipped to the floor. "Megan," Grace whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart." "You're alive," Megan sobbed. "I knew it. I knew it in my gut. Something always felt wrong. Mom, I can't believe." Grace stroked her daughter's hair, her own tears falling freely now. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here." Henry stepped back, giving them space, watching the embrace he'd feared his family would never share again. For the first time in weeks, his chest loosened. The weight lifted, slowly, unevenly, but it lifted. Sarah stood beside him, arms crossed lightly, her usual sharpness softened. "You did good, Henry," she said. "Most people fall apart halfway through something like this. You kept your head straight." Henry huffed a small, weary laugh. "I didn't feel steady." "That's not how steadiness works," she said. "You stayed focused, you listened, you didn't let fear make your choices, and that saved your family." Henry looked at her, this woman who had stepped in without hesitation, who had believed him from the start, who had dug through lies with the precision of someone who refused to fail. "Sarah," he said, voice low, "you saved us. All of us." She shrugged lightly, fighting a smile. "Just doing my job." But Henry shook his head. "No, not just your job." Sarah met his eyes, understanding flashing quietly between them. Down the hall, Grace and Megan held onto each other, as if making up for every hour stolen from them. Daniel sat nearby, watching with a mixture of guilt and relief, unsure where he fit, but wishing desperately to. And Henry stood at the center of it all, finally able to breathe, finally able to believe the nightmare had edges, and those edges were closing. But the story wasn't finished yet. One last truth still waited to be faced. The lake was still that evening, so still it looked like a sheet of darkened glass stretching into the trees. Henry stood at the water's edge, hands in his coat pockets, watching the faint orange of the setting sun melt into the rippling horizon. The air was cool, quiet, carrying only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets warming into night. Behind him, footsteps approached slowly. Grace. She came to a stop beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. Not from cold, but from the weight of the last few weeks. Weeks that had carved new shadows into her features. Weeks that had tested the limits of everything they'd built over a lifetime. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grace exhaled shakily. "Henry, I'm so sorry." He turned toward her, seeing the pain in her eyes, real, vulnerable, unguarded. "You don't need to apologize." "Yes," she whispered. "I do. I disappeared. I left without a word. I didn't trust that you could help me." Her voice wavered. "I made choices alone because I was terrified, and that fear made me shut you out." Henry stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Grace, you survived. That's all that matters." She blinked, tears pooling instantly. "You deserved the truth. You deserved better." Henry shook his head gently. "You did what you had to do. You were trapped. You were scared, and you still fought. None of this, none of it, was your fault." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not angry at you." Her breath caught. "Not even a little?" "A little," he admitted softly. "Not because you ran, but because you had to, because someone put you in a position where disappearing felt safer than coming home." Grace looked out at the water, wiping a tear that escaped down her cheek. "I just want us back," she murmured. "Not the way things were before all this, because we can't pretend it didn't happen, but something honest, something we can rebuild." Henry reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then we rebuild, slowly, together, one step at a time." Grace squeezed his hand, her shoulders finally loosening. The tension she'd carried since the night she vanished seemed to slip away, replaced with something lighter. Hope, fragile but real. Behind them, down the narrow dirt path, the soft sounds of voices drifted closer. Megan's laughter, relieved, unrestrained. Daniel's quieter tone beside her, careful, uncertain, trying. Henry and Grace turned toward the sound. Daniel walked with a hesitance that broke something inside Henry, a young man humbled by consequences, weighed down but trying. He gave his mother a small nod, part apology, part greeting, part promise. Therapy appointments were scheduled, financial advisors assigned. Sarah had arranged oversight so he could rebuild instead of collapse. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least the direction was clear. Megan reached them first, looping her arms around both her parents in a warm, fierce embrace. "Dinner's ready," she said with a smile that hadn't existed in weeks. And for once, Daniel didn't burn anything. Daniel winced. "I was supervised." Grace laughed, small, delicate, but real. A sound Henry hadn't thought he'd ever hear again. He brushed a hand gently along her back. "Let's go," he said. They walked together toward the cabin, lanterns glowing warmly along the porch, casting soft circles of light that looked almost like home. The table inside was set, simple, humble, but full. Roasted vegetables, rice, warm bread. The kind of meal that tasted better because it was earned. They ate, they talked. Megan teased Daniel. Daniel took it with a sheepish grin. Grace leaned against Henry occasionally, the warmth between them steadying, grounding. It was the first peaceful moment any of them had had in months. After dinner, as Megan washed dishes and Daniel dried them, with exaggerated care so as not to break anything, Henry and Grace stepped outside again. The night air was cool, the stars beginning to appear. Henry looked at Grace under the soft porch light. Her face still carried traces of what she'd endured, but her eyes were alive again. He reached for her hand. Grace looked at him, her expression softening. "We get another chance," she whispered. Henry nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside him. "A second goodbye," he said, "but a second beginning too." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the lake shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Henry closed his eyes, gratitude swelling through him like a tide. She was here. She was safe. And he had been given back the one thing he thought he'd lost forever: time with her.